CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy. This series on social movements in Africa was shot at the margins of the third Baraza in Accra. The Baraza is a product of the Zimbabwe Alliance, a project that the Conversations on African Philanthropy covered at the end of 2024. Social movements play huge roles in our society. At the same time, they face massive challenges and obstacles. In this series, we take a look at the different manifestations and typologies of social movements on the continent. The series is but a snapshot. More is needed to fully get a comprehensive grasp of social movements. Join us as we talk to actors from the DRC to Zambia, Malawi, Kenya, Zimbabwe, Ghana, and many more.
Welcome to another Conversations on African Philanthropy with me, Moyo. I'm excited to record this episode in Accra, Ghana, at the margins of the Baraza, the social movements meeting that is organized by TrustAfrica. I'm very excited at the moment to be joined by Gift Ostallos Siziba, a Zimbabwean activist, but also somebody who has done a lot of work in politics in the academy, a global recognized individual, and we are going to get into that. Gift, welcome to the Conversations.
Thank you very much, Prof.
Thank you so much. Let's start with where we just ended in the session that you were part of as a panelist. A heated conversation, in my view, but very, very important points that were coming out. Maybe let's start there and talk about why we are here in Accra. It's a social movements conference, but your session was focusing mainly on the interface, I would say, between social movements and politics. And you made some key points there. Maybe let's just summarize them for the audience.
Thank you very much. I think that TrustAfrica's convening is very important when the world is facing the current challenges and the continent in particular. So for Africans to convene at this historic moment, I think is very, very crucial. The conversation that I was just part of, thanks to this convening, was not just eye-opening, but also thought-provoking in terms of the nexus between power and social movement, in terms of to what extent do we have to go, do activists have to turn into politicians? And my submissions is that activists don't have to turn into politicians, but activists have to occupy power.
Yeah.
Because transitions that have happened in the African continent, all of it, if you look at empirical data of those transitions that have happened, whether with the military taking over or new civilian governments taking over, you'd realize that it becomes change without change. So that's my philosophical submission, that activists don't have to turn into politicians, but activists have to occupy positions of influence and power. For the following reasons. One, I think that activists bear the brand of oppression. The people who go into the streets, the people who push back on authoritarian consolidation are always activists, because they're the ones who organize people in the communities. But only when it comes to authority in terms of who govern, activists are taught to push back. So I think that there was someone who designed this thinking historically to ensure that people who are pure, people who are conscious, people who are capable, people who are genuine and authentic don't occupy political power, to the extent that politics is now publicly known as a dirty game. Why? Because the occupants are people who are not trained to work with the people, not trained to transform the lives of ordinary people. So my view is that politicians have to remain politicians, activists have to remain activists, but activists must think about their role post-transitions in government so that they know what the people want, they know the aspirations of the people. And I also submitted that it doesn't mean that social movements will die. Social movement work has to continue because any government has to be held accountable, but there must be a transition of people who have worked with the people with the capability to go now. If you look at anywhere in the world, democratic parties, in the case of our own country, the people who do think tanking are people in the civic space and social movements. The people who raise the case of Zimbabwe on the radar are activists, social movements, and civic society. So they basically do the work, but someone has to say, you must not cross here because that's our preserve, so that they continue with slogans, with emptiness, and processes without rigor. So I think that, for me, really empirical evidence calls us to really look in this?
I think one of the challenges, and I know in conversations like this, it does come up, but I don't think we do go into depth about it, is the role of political ideology when it comes to civic formations, especially social movements. I don't think you can do this work without some grounding in some particular political ideology. And in your case, you spoke about how you actually were trained in a particular ideology. Maybe let's talk about the ideology that you were founded and you are grounded in, and how that ideology and political thought process has helped you to deal with the different epochs in your life.
No, thank you very much. That's a very interesting topic for me, something that I'm very passionate about. When I went to the University of Zimbabwe at the time, the International Socialist Organization was very strong, and it grounded us because it then made us to, I don't think that any leader should fail to understand dialectic materialism. So Marxism was our first introductory conversation into politics. It made us understood what our struggle is all about. It planted deep in our conscience the central strategic objective of our struggle, what now we call the National Democratic Revolution. And Sankara became very important in our early days in activism, because Sankara says a soldier without ideological orientation is a potential criminal. So it means that everyone among us ourselves has a potential to become criminal, to become a fascist and a dictator. The only thing that is important to save you is your consciousness. So we are convinced, I am convinced without doubt, that any leader must be grounded philosophically. Well, that's the starting point, because your conscience becomes a reminder in everything that you do. When you interface with power, when you interface with communities, you are always grounded internally within you, that these are the limitations, these are the extent to which I must go. And you always connect the dots of your day-to-day struggles with the broad struggles of human progress and development of our society.
And if you look at the generality of civil society organizations, you were part of the student movement, and of course then you joined politics. But if you look at some of the groups that you know and you have worked with, to what extent would you think that grounding is present, especially when you look at the characterization of most civil society organizations in Africa now?
I think that right now the debate about the ideology has been put under the carpet. I think that because at one hand is the question around funding and financing of civil society organizations, but also I think that the emergence of civic work being a profession rather than it's things of passion. But despite all those challenges and contradictions, you can see, if you look at even the gathering here, and yourself included, there's still a lot of people who are grounded ideologically. So not all hope is lost in the case of civil society in Zimbabwe and in the African continent and in the world. Because that's why I was happy to be in this Baraza, because it reminds me that when you're in a cesspool of ideological deficiency in your own spaces, you then go to realize that no, I'm not alone, because the struggles that I'm facing, the commitments that I'm having, and the anchor that I have ideologically is not something that is utopian. There are people who still subscribe to these fundamental values and ideals. So it's a good, encouraging space to be, and a platform, because it shows that there's hope for future generations. There are still comrades, whether they are few and outnumbered by these populists that are rising. Because if you don't ground our people in ideology and ground our people in ideas and the big idea, what emerges is what we see now in the continent, the emergence of big men. And even Europe now subscribe to this idea that in Africa, rather let's have a strong man instead of a democratic dispensation. Case in point being Kagame and other countries. And I don't think that it works, because when you choose stability over democracy, you are actually creating instability, but that system is not sustainable. So I think that it's important, and there is hope in the civil society, there is hope in social movement, because some of the key leaders, some of the key conveners are still grounded to their ideological disposition. So it's important, because that has to be imparted. What I think has to be done there must be investment in cadreship development and ideological orientation. The debate must come back. The conversation must begin to be public. New generations that are coming in must begin to be immersed in these discourses, critiquing it. Someone raised in the conference about why is it some of us are remaining in the left or in the center. We do so, but we, in our own context, we make that ideology with our own characteristics. That's why China says we are practicing capitalism with Chinese characteristics. You are putting your own domestic and internal conditions that will make the ideological disposition you have taken capable to change the lives of your people.
So, I mean, I think in there you also spoke about the reality, which is the old are dying and the new ones need to be born. You are one of the few people that can say you benefited from a foundational infrastructure that trained you into a particular ideological orientation. When you look at the current young people and the opportunities and the spaces that are created or need to be created for them to take power, where do you see the infrastructures and the structures that helped you? Are they still present? And if not, what needs to be done to actually get young people to get into the spaces as prepared as you got yourself into that space?
Yeah, I think that in the face of the changing global order, what needs to be done, particularly in the African continent, is that a new conversation must begin where black African philanthropists and philanthropists across the world ought to begin a conversation about the nexus between philanthropy, politics, social movements, and power, and the quest for justice. I think that nexus is important. It's a conversation that I think that is not being done sufficiently, and I think that it must be invested upon, because I went to school with the finance of philanthropist, Africa's one of Africa's billionaires, Strive Masiwa, took me to school under the Joshua Ngomo Scholarship Foundation in Zimbabwe. And I think it was important because it offered me a platform to go to university. A university which then became very critical in grounding me both ideologically and academically as an intellectual. And I think that, but it did so without any underground or embedded intentions, with genuineness to invest in the future of our nation. And I think that that conversation must be expanded. That work must be looked into, especially now, the fact that there's limited support for the work that young people are doing, particularly in democracy, because there's this emerging appetite that democracy doesn't work. And once that democracy work collapses in the continent, you are giving free will to dictators. If you look at Zimbabwe right now, there's a PVO bill that basically wants to regulate or close down civic space. And in the absence of civic society, it means that fascism will flourish. And it's an important conversation to all right-thinking citizens of the world to begin to look at what's happening in the world and begin to look at, in the era of democratic backsliding, what work has to be done to continue lifting the flag high, to continue not to undermine the work or not to make it fizzle out. Because why am I saying this? I work in communities. Day to day, I stay in Chabala. That's where I grew up. I realize the importance of the work that is being done. Most of you, when you do it, you think you are just empowering people. Reports are not even sufficient to capture the impact of the work that you are doing, Prof. Beg, because there are millions of people in the case of Zimbabwe who look up to us. And that's the constant reminder I have every time when I'm offered trinkets and trappings of power, that look, what will happen to those people? Because the privilege that I have to fly from Zimbabwe to Accra is not born out of the fact that probably my parents were rich. The privilege came with the responsibility that is out of the genuine inspirations and desires and the concrete grievances of our people. So every time my conscience is taken aback, because whatever platform I've been given, I've sat in the same platform with President Obama in Washington during the Democracy Summit. And what got me thinking at the time was that this privilege is because I represent the genuine, real aspirations and grievances of my people. And every time I must hold this office with so much dignity, with so much responsibility and so much care.
I mean, I'm glad that you raised that, because I think one of the things that you did in one of the conversations I saw is you spoke about how you were supported by philanthropy. but at the same time manage to contextualize the critique that philanthropy normally gets, especially because philanthropy is born out of capitalism.
Very true.
And your ideology would be something that,
is contrary.
It's contrary to that. But I want us to revisit that so that people can understand the contradictions, but also the coexistences that actually happen between philanthropy, capitalism, and development.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point and question, because when I was at the university, and I was very so much active in the radical left politics, and in one of the sessions I condemned my founder, and said, "Man, nobody is an agent of capital, is a petty bourgeois," and some people were not happy. But what made me realize that there's an intersection is because the person I was talking about, who was paying my tuition fee, never got offended and understood my passion and convictions, and said, "Look, I have a role. Even if I'm leaning more to the right, I have a role to ensure that." And what was that intersection that we discovered? That intersection is justice. That intersection is progress. That intersection is uplifting humanity. Despite that, we've got philosophical and ideological differences. We managed to converge on the key questions of transforming society. The only thing that differs was that the way they want to do it and the way we want to do it. But both agree that all of us are Africans. All of us are passionate about making the lives of ordinary people better. The only way we differ, myself and our friends in the extreme right, is that they are good at making profit, but they're not good at redistributing it. So that's why some of us believe that the state must then play a pivotal role in making sure that it redistributes profit for the benefit of those that are historically disadvantaged, because capitalists and profit-making people forget that there is history to our society and our country. So we constantly remind them that, look, let the state, because you are not good empirically in redistributing wealth, but you are good in making it. So let the state play a role in regulating your access to profit and the means of production, so that the state then. So now the conversation we are having is that we ought to then make the state to be directly connected to the people, to be genuine and to be authentic. That's why capitalists, of course, argue that the state is not capable of redistributing wealth, because it will loot the wealth for their own selfish benefit. So that's why we must then now have a conversation about how do we create the state. So the state is not utopian. It takes us back to our debate we're having this afternoon, that the state is occupied by human beings. So the question is, who are these human beings that must occupy the state so that it redistributes wealth for the benefit of the people? It is people that are credible, that are honest, but with the necessary crafty competence to run the state.
And somebody in the social movements must then hold them accountable.
Precisely the point.
So fascinating conversation, because I actually think that it takes me to a conversation around, yesterday there was a conversation around how social movements are struggling for funding. And traditionally and historically, social movements have shied away from receiving money from corporates, from capitalists, so to speak. And yet we are living in a world where to really get substantive funding, we've got to look into those sources. The issue is how to utilize those resources, to redistribute them, as you said. But in your own thoughts right now, if one were to say, how should social movements be funded going forward? What would be some of your 2 or 3 advice points for social movements?
I think that the first point, I'll speak of it from the African perspective. I think that the first point is that social movement must be grounded with the people. That's the first thing. And that will also give in to the question around funding and financing of social movement as the first point of entry. So I think that social movements ought to have domestic ways to mobilize. That's one. Number two, I think that the biggest source of funding for social movements, particularly in the African continent, is the African diaspora. I think the internet is making the world one and making people be able to access each other online. So I think that the African diaspora must be able to be convened. So those who are activists on the ground must be able to have platforms and conversations with those in the African diaspora, so that they're able to begin to finance and fund struggles.
Yeah.
The second thing, I think that there must be convening between social movements and philanthropists, particularly in this continent, so that people begin to have a conversation about the role of corporates, because they are also the immediate victims as people in business of the instability in countries. They are the victims of the injustice in countries. If you look at it in the case of Zimbabwe, Strive Masiwa had an issue with the government, which is why he's in exile. And if you check that history, because of the politics of the country. So they are the immediate casualties, just like ordinary people, of unstable countries and directionless political orders and knee-jerk policies by government. If you look at Zimbabwe, we've got a problem with the monetary policy and the currency issue. It makes business environment very difficult. So it is in the interest of those who are in the business sector to begin an honest conversation with those who are committed to make things right in the African continent. So that intersection is what I think must be invested on in terms of people convening as the first point, and then also empirical evidence in terms of those who are passionate about writing. Let research is being done, let surveys be done to quantify and qualify this submission, that there must be an intersection between corporates and social movement. There must be an intersection between the diaspora and social movement, and more importantly, domestic activists and those that are in the country, to begin to get synergies, so that there is no tagging and flagging and painting of activists as Western funded, but there must be people with particular interest. That interest is justice, is stable society and progress for everyone.
So Gifta, I would have loved to really talk about your experiences in politics, but I think you have spoken a lot about that in other platforms. But is it fair to summarize that your input in a way suggested that one can still hold political power without necessarily being in political office?
It is the case of the African continent. I think that at law you can be a de jure leader. We don't hold legal office. I was removed from parliament, despite that my people in the community and my political party still wanted me to be there. And I understood, because when I went there, I knew that it was going to upset the powers that be. It is going to upset those that I've been fighting against in my country. So I understood, because one, I went there not as a career choice, but out of a desire to see a changed society. So I think that you can continue, and I continue with my people hold me to account now. I don't go to parliament chambers, but people call me and say, there is this problem in the community, you must fix this. I've never gone to someone and say, no, but I'm no longer your member of parliament. I continue to provide the necessary leadership in my community, because they are what are called leaders without title. So I think you can lead without a title, because if your intentions are wired with the community, are wired with the society, and you are passionate about it, you continue to lead. And I'm happy, because one, my people continue to hold me to account, and secondly, I'm also able to convene them, because if you're a leader without a social contract, you can't do anything, because I'm here because they've given me a mandate, and my political organization also has trust and confidence in our leadership. So for me, as someone who was an activist coming into political spaces, it has helped me to maintain my conscience. I'm happy. If I'm to die today, I know that I've contributed to the annals of history of my country and my continent, and my conscience is clean. So it's proving to me that you can go in with your conscience and come out with your conscience, not going in and then being removed, with machetes and stuff like that. So I think that is an interesting space to be for myself, and I continue to encourage other young people to go into politics, but with their conscience, but with the necessary grounding and understanding of the objectives of the National Democratic Project.
Ostallos, thank you so much for joining us at the margins of the Baraza. And like I said, there's a lot that we could speak about, but thank you for taking the time after giving such a powerful speech at the last session. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Prof.
Thank you so much. That was Gift Ostallos Siziba, a former member of parliament for Chabalala constituency for the CCC movement, a researcher and academic, but also an emerging global leader of note. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.